Hello and welcome to the first episode of a new Doctor Who podcast called The Man Who Never Would. I am George and this is my co-host Owen.
Hello.
And this is a new Doctor Who podcast. In every episode we'll be discussing an episode of Doctor Who starting right back in the 1960s, and we'll be looking at them from a number of perspectives. We'll be looking at them from a pacifist and also a feminist perspective. So we've got a few reasons for that. We're going to start off with the first ever episode, which is An Unearthly Child, and we'll be coming to that in a few minutes. But first, I just want to get a bit of an idea as to why we're making this podcast. So, Owen, Doctor Who means a huge amount to you, doesn't it?
Yes, it
You've loved
does.
it since you were a child, and I think from having conversations with you, it's really helped your understanding of who you are as a person, hasn't it?
Yeah, the reason I've fallen in love with this show, basically, is that, of course, it's got great stories, but the main reason is the protagonist, the Doctor, is a great portrayal of how a man should be. And what I mean by that is the fact that, like I was talking about, that you said earlier, about being a pacifist, which the Doctor is, and a feminist, which I believe the Doctor is as well.
Yeah, and we're both staunch feminists.
Oh, we are. And I think, the thing is, I've loved Doctor Who, and I got into it when it came back in 2005, but I've also been interested in the ones before then as well, and I've looked at the back catalogue and all that, and it's such a great show, but it's also a great show that shows feminism, doesn't it? And I just feel recently there's been a lot of things in the media saying how Doctor Who wasn't really like a feminist show, and I really believed it was, and that's the reason why I want to go through the back catalogue of Doctor Who, rewatch them, have fun just looking at the stories, the characters, and just having a real fun chat about all that, but also seeing the political side of it as well, and addressing it really, and showing that it was there in the way people don't see it today.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, Owen, and that's why we've decided to call this podcast The Man Who Never Would, isn't it? Because
yes, from a David Tennant episode.
It is. It's from The Doctor's Daughter, which aired in 2008, which is the one with Georgia Moffat starring as Jenny and The Doctor's Daughter. And it's actually not one of my favourite episodes. We'll talk about it when we eventually get to it, hopefully. Fingers crossed.
Long way to get to that one.
Yeah, the podcast goes on that long, which hopefully it will, because we've got lots of ideas, haven't we? But yeah, I'm not that keen on that episode for a number of reasons, but I just really like that line. And with the way that David Tennant says, make the foundation of this society a man who never would.
It sums up Doctor Who, doesn't it?
It sums up Doctor Who from a character's perspective.
Yes,
doesn't
definitely,
it?
definitely.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Doctor Who's had as much of an impact on me as it has on you, but I did watch it a lot when I was a teenager, and I definitely think that there are ideas and positions in that which have fed into how I feel about things now as an adult. I watched a few of the classic era episodes. I started watching the Hartnell ones when I was very young, about 13, and then I realised that they didn't all exist, so I sort of gave it up, and then a friend of mine showed me a few Sylvester McCoy ones and a few Peter Davison ones and so on. So I will be really interested in seeing them all systematically and finding out how the ideas developed. So without further ado, we're going to leap into the first ever episode, which is
Getting our time machines,
exactly. I was very tempted to do a TARDIS noise then, but in the interests of our viewers' attention spans and sanity, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, the first episode is An Unearthly Child, which originally aired on November the 23rd, 1963. The episode was written by Anthony Coburn, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by Waris Hussein. And just as a little bit of progressive notation, Verity Lambert was the first female TV producer at the BBC, and Waris Hussein is both Asian and gay. So that's quite cool. Even the first episode had an Asian director, which is, I think, a lot of people might be surprised about for the 1960s, but it does show that Doctor Who's very ahead of its time, doesn't it? At the time that this episode was broadcast, Harold MacMillan was the UK Prime Minister, And the President of the United States was Lyndon B. Johnson, which is an interesting one because he'd only acquired that position in the previous 24 hours because this episode happened to be broadcast on the day after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which actually, when you think about it, must have been a bit of a nightmare for the producers, mustn't it?
Yes, and even though this isn't as drastic as that, even when it came back in 2005, there were some areas in the UK where they could hear some strange sound that was meant to be coming from...
Because it was mixed with Graham Norton presenting Strictly Dance Fever.
That's right, they played it over the top of the live viewing... Well, I say live, when they first broadcast this new Doctor Who.
I remember hearing them talking about this on the audio commentary on the DVD for the episode of Rose, because they've been working on this for years. I suppose they've been working on that one for probably quite a bit longer than they've been working on Unearthly Child. And it must have just been quite a nightmare, in this case a major world event. I think An Unearthly Child was broadcast about a minute after it was meant to be broadcast.
But at least it shows that Doctor Who obviously has something special to it, that even because of these problems, it still captures people and it's still here today.
It has stood the test of time, hasn't it? And that's really what I want to analyse in this podcast. So this episode brought us quite a lot of new ideas, didn't it? It obviously introduced us to the TARDIS for the first time. And it introduced us to some important characters. It introduced us to the first Doctor, who was, of course, played by William Hartnell, and the Doctor's first three companions, who are history teacher Barbara Wright, played by Jacqueline Hill, science teacher Ian Chesterton, who's played by William Russell, and 15-year-old schoolgirl Susan Foreman, who's played by Carol Ann Ford.
Yes, and isn't it wonderful how they put a lot of thought on the professions of Barbara and Ian? So, like, the fact that Barbara is a history teacher and Ian is a science teacher, that links him with the connection of the Doctor and how he travels through time and space, He goes into historic events, and the science links with the whole space part of it all as well.
It does. It's really interesting. I completely agree with you, Owen. If they were teaching anything else, it wouldn't work as effectively, would it?
No, exactly.
It's quite a bit of a shorter episode than we're used to these days, isn't it? It's only just over 20 minutes long, but it does do a lot in that short space of time.
It gets a lot in, yes.
It does, and unusually, firstly, there isn't any kind of threat in this episode. It's literally character development all the way, which I personally like. And also, apart from extras, there isn't really anyone in this episode, apart from the Doctor and his companions, are there?
So this episode starts off with a policeman walking around a junkyard, which is called 76 Totter's Lane. And then the camera...
We see the TARDIS in that little moment as well, don't we?
Well, not quite. It's the camera goes into the junkyard. The policeman's just outside, isn't he? I believe. And the camera goes in and we see the police box actually in the junkyard. And it settles on the writing on the police box itself, which blurs into the next scene where we see words of the school written on the wall, which is
Coal Hill School.
Yeah, it's a lovely transition how they did that.
Yeah, I think there was actually a short-lived spin-off about Coal Hill School recently, wasn't there? But it didn't really do that
Didn't really take off, sadly, no.
No, it didn't. One thing I really like about this episode, actually, there's nothing in the episode to say exactly where it is.
No, that's true.
If you compare it to an episode like Rose, which is very, very London-centric... I mean, I do like that, and I suppose they probably did need a big, extravagant episode for the first revived episode. But I do like the fact that this school could be anywhere in the country. It feels like it could be happening to you. So at this point we meet
Barbara and Ian,
and they are concerned about one of their students, who is a girl called Susan, who we find out later only arrived at the school 5 months ago. And she's fascinating because she has vastly more knowledge about their subjects than they do, which irritates them and fascinates them in equal measure.
Yeah, this is a wonderful scene, and I think this would be a good time to play our first clip.
She knows more science than I'll ever know. She's a genius. Is that what she's doing with history?
Something like that.
So your problem is whether to stay in business or hand over the class to her.
No, not quite.
What then?
Ian, I must talk to someone about this, but I don't want to get the girl into trouble. And I know you're going to tell me I'm imagining things.
I'm not.
Well, I told you how good she is at history. I had a talk with her, and I told her she ought to specialize. Well, she seemed quite interested till I said I'd be willing to work with her at her home. Then she said that would be absolutely impossible, as her grandfather didn't like strangers.
He's a doctor, isn't he? It's a bit of a lame excuse.
I love that.
Me too. But there's also a lot of things about current culture that she's just unaware of, things that you just expect a 15-year-old to know. The story is that when Barbara actually went to talk to Susan's grandfather and she got her address from the secretary and so on, she just turned up and there was nothing there. There wasn't a house there or anything. It was just an old junkyard, which is presumably the junkyard that we saw at the beginning of the episode. So we meet Susan. I think that it's a wonderful first appearance of Susan because she simultaneously looks like a 15-year-old girl, but at the same time she doesn't. And Carol Ann Ford plays that so incredibly well. Ian offers her a lift home, but Susan says she likes walking through the dark because it's mysterious.
Wonderful line, love that.
They follow Susan home. Well, they don't exactly follow her, but they end up sitting outside the junkyard in the car, discussing what's going on.
Waiting to see if she turns up.
And she does turn up.
She does, yeah.
We also see a few flashbacks in this scene to things that have happened in the classrooms. One thing that really interested us
was that they predicted the future.
They predicted the future.
I thought you agreed she was a bit of a mystery.
Yes, but I think you'll find there's a very simple explanation to all this.
Well, I don't know how you explain the fact that a teenage girl does not know how many shillings there are in a pound.
Really?
Really. She said she thought we were on the decimal system.
Decimal system?
I'm sorry, Miss Wright. Don't be silly, Susan. The United States has a decimal system. You know perfectly well that we do not.
Of course the decimal system hasn't started yet.
Of course, there have been many, many attempts over the years to predict the future in Doctor Who, some more successfully than others. But this very first time, they predicted it very accurately. And of course, the decimal system, it was implied, was going to start soon. And Susan had just got the time period slightly wrong, which of course she had, because the decimal system did come in just 8 years later. So anyway, at this point, Susan arrives. They watch her go into the junkyard. They talk about it for a little while, and then they follow her in. They go in. They can't find her anywhere, which is odd because there's only one way in and out. But they look around and they find a police box, which was a very, very common sight in 1960s England, but normally on the streets. They wouldn't be in a junkyard. Ian goes near the box and he finds that there's an electricity buzz there. And he thinks, it's alive! And at that point, we get a really fantastic introduction to our lead character, don't we?
Yeah, the first thing we hear is him coughing, isn't it?
It is.
Oh.
You hear a cough before you hear him say anything. And it's just wonderful. And it certainly says something about that first incarnation of the character, in that he's a bit of a sour-faced old man. But he's just wonderful. And Barbara and Ian approach him and ask him about Susan.
They hear Susan speak, and then Ian confronts the Doctor.
And the Doctor basically just blows both of them off.
He does. One of the best bits for me is he finds a mirror frame and he's distracting himself from it to show that they're not important. And then when they start talking to him again, I think it's Barbara, he said he looks at her like, oh, like as if he's forgotten who they are. I think you generally think he does as well. You don't think he's just putting it on.
Well, there's two ways of interpreting that scene, isn't there?
Yeah.
Like, you can either see it as he's deliberately ignoring them, which I wouldn't put past him. Or secondly, he is genuinely so interested in that mirror frame that he's forgotten they're even there.
And I think what's really important to mention, to link this with the 2005 comeback series with Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper, is how Christopher Eccleston is written and acts the same way, to be honest, like William Hartnell does with his Doctor. There's an edge to them both. You're not quite sure if you like them or not, but they're both still fascinating characters. You don't think they're bad or anything, but there's also a great underlying humour.
They get into the police box. They do eventually force their way in, and they find that, shock horror, it's bigger on the inside. Which,
and it still looks incredible when you watch it now.
especially for 1960s. How exciting would that have been if you were a child in those days?
I know.
And something I particularly want to bring up, which was actually more sophisticated in the 1960s than it is now, which is the closing and opening of the doors. Because these days, I think it's just an ordinary door handle from the inside, isn't it?
so.
Whereas back then, the Doctor would close them on the console, and there was even a cool sci-fi noise to go with it. And they find Susan, and Susan says that, you know, she was born in another time, and this ship is called the TARDIS. Something that's quite cool, which is revealed in this episode, and I feel like it's maybe retconned a bit later, but I love the idea of this, which is that Susan actually made up the acronym herself, which causes a bit of a continuity error later, but I really like to imagine that is the case. So anyway, they have this conversation. They argue about it for quite a long time. The Doctor compares the dimensions inside the TARDIS to the dimensions of an enormous building being shown on television and saying, well, that means that you can get an enormous building into one of your smaller sitting rooms.
Yes, he does. I just love the conflict between Ian and the Doctor, actually.
It is wonderful. I think my personal favourite bit is the bit about the children from my civilization, and we've got a bit of a clip here that I think we have to play because it's so beautifully recorded.
It's this wonderful speech.
You're treating us like children.
Am I? Children of my civilization would be insulted.
Your civilization?
Yes, my civilization. I tolerate this century, but I don't enjoy it. Have you ever thought what it's like to be wanderers in the fourth dimension? Have you? To be exiles? Susan and I are cut off from our own planet, without friends or protection. But one day, we shall get back. Yes, one day.
Yeah, and I just want to say as well that the Doctor actually patronises Ian the most, I think.
He does, yeah.
And the reason I want to bring that up is because, again, it's showing that even though he was like that to all his companions and his granddaughter then, he did it to all of them. And I just want to bring that up because I think nowadays people feel that he did that to patronise the women at the time.
I don't think he was that patronising to his granddaughter in this.
No, that's true. It is literally mainly Ian.
It is mainly Ian. Like, Barbara, I think, is mostly ignored. Susan is treated with a great deal of respect. Probably because Ian's the one that's being the most confrontational out of all of them.
I guess so, yes.
Yeah.
And I just want to make a point as well that we're just coming to the end of the story of this, is that basically he ends up trapping them in the TARDIS. They end up travelling, and that's how they end the episode. But I just want to say that even though he's been like this to Ian and Barbara, I really think that he sensed two highly intelligent people.
Very much so.
And that's what he's like. He wants to outwit them, but he loves the fact that he can do this with them, play with them in that way, because he likes to be surrounded people who can challenge him, I guess. I think that's what he wants. That's what he needs.
The fact that they've even found the TARDIS in the first place is significant. And I suppose that's a thing that's been the case with every companion. Like, the first episode of A New Companion, I suppose this one's a bit different because there isn't an alien threat, but normally when there's the first episode of A New Companion, the companion does something in order to win the fight that the Doctor wasn't able to do himself. Even though there isn't so much of a fight in this, the fact that they even discover the TARDIS and manage to force their way inside is very significant.
You kind of think that he kind of planned it, which I don't think he did. But
I don't think he did, but you can see how he could have done, can't you?
Yeah.
So just to quickly summarise the end of the episode, Susan says that she's going to leave the TARDIS. The Doctor seems to say, oh, all right then. But of course, the moment Susan's back is turned, the Doctor takes the TARDIS off. There is a wonderful scene with, for the 1960s, amazing graphics, which is very similar to the opening titles.
Yeah, so the TARDIS goes off and travels into the vortex.
Beautifully, there's one thing there which has never changed, which is the sound of the TARDIS dematerialising.
Oh, I know, it's a wonderful sound.
It is an incredibly wonderful sound. And then at the end, the TARDIS ends up on a hill and there's a shadow. And that's the end of the episode. Yeah. End credits. So let's discuss some of the characters in this.
Yeah.
So we've obviously got three companions. I'd like to start with Susan, if I might. Because I think that being the Doctor's granddaughter, she is unique as companions go. A big part of this podcast is about feminism. A lot of the companions, actually not so much in recent times, because with the casting of Jodie Whittaker, they've had a couple more male companions, but throughout history, the vast majority of the Doctor's companions have been women. And you came up with a really interesting idea, Owen, which I was really intrigued by, which is that I'm not sure if the writers meant it like this. It was probably just for casting purposes to have a more diverse cast. But from a storyline-wise, it's really fascinating to think that the reason the Doctor's gone for so many young girls is that he's really trying to find a replacement for his granddaughter, who was the original girl with him.
Yeah, that's how I've always seen it. I don't necessarily know, like you say, if the writers intended that, but I'd like to think they did.
I really like to think that. even if they didn't intend it, I suppose that's one of the great parts of Doctor Who, isn't it? That there's so much that you can see in the Doctor's actions that might not even have been what the writers intended, but you can interpret so much more yourself. And I always think the best stories are parts where the viewer has an active part in them.
Susan is just a really interesting character in the sense of, well, the mystery, you don't know what... Obviously, she's from a different planet, we find out, but the fact that she's got all this knowledge...
Yes.
She seems like quite fun at the same time, like she wants to blend in with the whole 60s thing.
The thing that I also find fascinating about Susan is that even though she's travelling with her grandfather, I don't have the impression that the Doctor necessarily has that much control over her. I mean, even the fact that they're there in the first place, we all know that the Doctor does not stay grounded in one place. That's a major part of the Doctor's character. And I don't think there is any companion from subsequent series, even Rose, who's the one who he was completely besotted by, who would have been able to persuade him to stay in one place for that length of time. Susan is able to make that decision and make him stick to it.
Yes, but it's also nice, I suppose, on the Doctor's side that he does want his granddaughter to be happy and to fit in. And it's good that he's allowing that as well, I suppose. And
he just can't let her go, because she threatens it in the end. You can even see the Doctor's point in this, which is that if he lets Ian and Barbara go, they must leave. And Susan stands up to him on that. So, actually, maybe I'll go back on what I said a second ago. Maybe Susan's the most confrontational in this, actually, because she insists on staying. And this is another interesting comparison with Rose in 2005, because Rose had a very ordinary life as a 19-year-old. She worked in a shop, she had a very ordinary mother and an ordinary boyfriend, and she dreamed of a more adventurous life. And Susan is the complete reverse of Rose.
Yeah.
Because she has an adventurous life, and she dreams of having an ordinary life as an ordinary person. Which is a fascinating idea, because I suppose the idea of an ordinary person having extraordinary dreams is a tale as old as time, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you very rarely hear about it the other way around.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's the funny thing, is he needs her more than she needs him.
Exactly, because
he knows that.
He does know that. So Susan is such a fantastic character. I think that's pretty much all we can say about her, isn't it?
So, shall we talk about Ian and Barbara next? Ian, I think, is just an everyday man. And what I mean by this is he just wants to get his job done. He's quite laid back. He wants an easy life. I also want to say that he is a skeptic. He's not the one that believes in such strange going-ons. I love the fact that he's sensitive, he's caring, he's not macho. I know I keep bringing this up, but he's not. And I just like the fact that he does stand up to the Doctor.
He does.
But he doesn't do it in a aggressive way. You can get a bit wound up, but he does it in a very, like, I want to talk reasonable with you, a bit like a teacher, I suppose, which is what he is.
Yes.
He goes along with it, but he thinks, no.
Barbara is a bit more of a maverick in terms of their planning it out.
She is. She takes the leading role, actually, which is great. And I think she's more wanting an adventure, actually. They both become investigators, which is quite cool. But I think it's Barbara that pushes it. I think if it was just Ian on his own, he wouldn't have got as far as the junkyard.
Whereas Barbara would.
Yes,
she's grateful for Ian's support, and Ian is a very handy ally for her.
Yeah.
But she would get there by herself. I have the impression that at the school, in their jobs as teachers, they're on an equal footing. However, if there was a promotion going, Barbara would get it.
Yeah. And what's so great is that they're not trying to catch Susan out or anything. Barbara and Ian, especially Barbara, is just really intrigued who this girl is, and she knows there's something more going on, even though she can't quite put her finger on it.
Exactly. And I think, particularly from talking to my parents, I feel that in terms of education in those days, there was a bit of a different understanding to what there might be now. So, for example, I think a teacher might be quite taken aback if a student was asking a lot of questions, because in those days teenagers weren't really seen as young adults in the way that they are today. You know, you'd grow up and you get to 21 in those days, and then you go from being child to adult. There wasn't really anything in between. So I feel that Barbara and Ian in particular are actually really showing themselves to be the teachers that you want to have. And from a pragmatic perspective in Doctor Who, that's really ahead of its time.
Yeah, they seem really like inspiring characters, aren't they? But they're really caring.
Very much so. It's actually interesting to have this number of people on board the TARDIS, isn't it? Because obviously they've done it again slightly recently with Jodie Whittaker because she's got 3 companions. But for most of the revived series, there's only been 1 or occasionally 2. And not that I've got any objection to that, but I do like it when there's a bit more of a team.
Oh, definitely. I guess with Ian, I suppose he is the one that most of the viewers can latch on because he's the most ordinary in the sense that I think he is the one that just got caught up in it all. Barbara just wants to have the adventure, I think. When I say that, she's still a bit obviously scared of what's happening, but there is more of a spark in her to...
There is, yes. Well, you're right, that Ian is always finding the natural way of things. Like he says, well, what if she's meeting a boy? Yeah. And then Barbara says that she hopes that she is because it would be so normal.
Yeah, great line.
But then if she had been, the rest of the story wouldn't have happened. But to summarise, all 3 of them are incredibly strong companions, aren't they? And for me, as someone who hasn't seen that many of the classic episodes, I'll be really interested to see how future generations of companion teams work, because I think it's going to be a long time before any of them have the strength of these original 3. They've got Ian and Barbara, who bring the human side of things, the Doctor, who at this point is unapologetically alien, and then you have Susan, who is a bridge between the 2. And I think that's what the TARDIS team needs.
Okay, so back onto the Doctor now.
Well, I always think the most popular Doctor in the classic era, I think, is Tom Baker. The most popular Doctor in the revived era is probably David Tennant. I mean, I like David Tennant. I think he's an amazing actor. However, I think that he did lose a bit of the edge to the Doctor, because the Doctor should not be that likeable a person. And I think that, unfortunately, David Tennant's popularity has changed some of the way that we see the Doctor in popular culture, because I think he's seen as this likeable and wonderful and kind character that viewers should look up to. And the Doctor is all of those things, but he's a lot more than that, because he can be wrong. And I think it's important to remember that he is an alien and he doesn't really understand human concepts. And that's actually talked about a lot in this episode when Susan says, I understand the way that these people's minds work better than you do, grandfather.
Even though Tennant does have some of that edge sometimes, as you say, it's definitely lost a lot more than we see in other Doctors.
Yeah, I agree, very much so. Do you think that at this point in the series they'd quite established the Doctor as a pacifist yet?
Not at all. The reason I'm saying that is not necessarily this episode, but from what I've seen Hartnell possibly carry out in some later episodes. But, again, they do confront it, and he does change. The Doctor evolves as a character, and that's thanks to Ian, Barbara.
Yes.
And they help him become the character you see now, I guess.
And it's interesting, the comparison between that and 2005 as well, because I think that Christopher Eccleston's Doctor was much less of a pacifist than the other Doctors have been as well, but for a completely different reason.
Yeah.
The fact that there was the Time War, and I suppose Russell T Davies needed an excuse to make him a bit less of a pacifist, and that's the charm of the 2005 series, isn't it? Is that you see Billie Piper's character very slowly and quite gently restore the Doctor into being the more pacifist side, which is David Tennant's side.
Which exactly what Ian and Barbara does this Doctor, and it's fascinating actually to see the resemblance of the both.
Yeah.
And again, it's like you say, they're both different stories of why he's become like this, but it both involve the fact that it's to do with where he's from and the Time Lords, which you find out he is. There is a heart, well, 2 hearts in fact, that we find out in this character, but it's hidden there because he's had a lot of bad things happen to him. We don't actually know what the circumstances are with this Doctor.
It's hinted at a bit later, isn't it?
Yeah. But again, it's just, he's from a background that's not very nice. And I think he is someone who is nice, and he's trying to escape from that.
The Time Lords are quite difficult. He doesn't really get on with them very much, does he? And that's discussed a bit later. So yeah, William Hartnell, do you think that he's got a side to him that future Doctors didn't have, in a bit of a way?
Well, that's interesting. I've been thinking all the things that they've kept.
Maybe actually not that much.
No, I think we always see a bit of him somewhere. So, let's see. He's eccentric. Because a lot of people say, oh, he's just the angry Doctor. But he's not. He's still got the eccentricity. He's very amusing.
He'd be fun to have a drink with down the pub, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Well, he's a lot like Tom Baker in that sense, I suppose. The edges we're talking about that he has, we see in Eccleston.
Yes.
we see in Peter Capaldi.
I think something that he says in this episode, which I'm not sure if they really developed this, because I'm not sure how far they planned it out, but he says that he and Susan are exiled from their planet at this point. And I can definitely see that in William Hartnell, because almost in a similar way to Christopher Eccleston after the Time War, there's something a bit bitter about him.
Yeah.
I think he would rather be on his planet than here on Earth. I think he's quite uncomfortable about it, and that goes back to that whole thing about I tolerate this century but I don't enjoy it.
Yeah, and although I've seen this episode before, I actually forgot that moment, and it's really interesting because the Doctor does change, and he's not like that now, is he?
No.
He wants to be more Earth-based, so that's really interesting. My favourite moment, I think, which captures the Doctor for me in this episode, is when the focus is on him, but you hear Ian and Barbara whispering to themselves behind him, worrying what to do. He's messing with like an old-fashioned vase. This is the scene where William Hartnell establishes the character of the Doctor to the viewer, because every look he does is every personality and qualities of the Doctor, and I love that. It shows his cheeky side, it shows his scary side, it shows his kind side as well even, and his eccentricness as well. Everything. It's just wonderful. I love that scene.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really good to be able to show all of the sides of the Doctor at once, because I think sometimes you can do a different one in every episode, but you need to be able to do more than that. You need to be able to show that this is the same character.
Well, he had to establish this character in a short amount of time, and even though the episode's short and he did it all through the episode, that scene for me just summed it up. That this is the Doctor, viewers, this is him, and yeah, amazing.
From a feminist perspective, I think this episode is amazing because it shows Susan, who stands up to the Doctor. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because when Doctor Who was brought back in 2005, I heard a lot of people, even Russell T Davies, saying that in the early days, maybe not so much in the 1980s, but definitely in the early days, the companions were really there to get into trouble and be rescued a lot. Not on this evidence they aren't. Maybe it changes in subsequent episodes, but I feel that we see Susan, who is more than a match for the Doctor, standing up to him, and we also see Barbara, who takes the lead in trying to sort things out.
Exactly, yeah.
I actually find this episode to be really strongly and unapologetically feminist, which is remarkable for 1963. Although I suppose that was the time when feminism was beginning to take hold. You know, that was the era of second wave feminism. So I suppose Doctor Who latched on to a political movement that was starting out and worked with it. I feel like we should get onto our star ratings.
Oh, yes.
So we're going to do it in terms of story, character, tech, and feminism.
We're going to do it out of 5 stars, but we've got a bit of a Doctor Who
twist on it. So we've got 1 star, which is Exterminate. 2 stars, more of a Cyberman. You must be upgraded. Excuse my Nick Briggs impression. 3 stars, which is Earth Standard. 4 stars, which in terms of Eccleston is fantastic. And 5 stars, which, quoting Derek Jacobi, is utopia. Story. Unfortunately, as much as I love this first episode, it's all character introduction. And I love the character introduction. I think it's necessary. But there isn't that much story to it.
Yeah,
and
not so much plot in it.
I don't think it can go beyond a 3, unfortunately. So that is Earth Standard. Which I suppose is still very good for an opening episode. But as I said, to make up for that, we need a utopia star on character.
Oh, 100%.
Definitely.
I mean, they've really summed up these people that we're going to be watching for the next...
Very much so,
year or so? No.
Technology, for 1963, it's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's still a bit archaic, but that is to be expected. I think there's still room for improvement, which is why, for me, I would give it a fantastic 4-star. Is that good enough for you?
Yep.
And feminism is interesting because we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? And I honestly don't think they could have done anything better in terms of the portrayal of the women characters on this and showing how good they are, as well as showing a caring side as well. Because I think that's something that a lot of modern-day feminists forget, which is that to be a strong woman, you don't need to go in carrying a gun.
No, exactly.
Being a feminist is not saying that women need to be just as violent as men. It's quite the contrary. It's saying that women and men should be free from the patriarchy. There is a real demonstration of strength in how you care for something. Ian and Barbara are both very caring human beings. And I think that's a really strong thing to do with feminism. Having said that, I don't think I can quite give it a utopia standard, simply because it's just the first episode and there needs to be room for improvement.
Should we say fantastic then?
Again, I'm going to say fantastic, which means that the mean score for that episode is a 4, which makes it a fantastic episode 1. The next episode is The Cave of Skulls.
Yep, and I hope everyone will listen to that and support our podcast, I guess.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm George, and this is my co-host Owen. We'll be back next week.
Bye.